Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It's Wednesday again, and here we are, gathered together to discuss amongst ourselves another facet of our wonderful world. Today's subject: what is algae? Now, to start, we have to get something very straight. We have to get something clear. The proper way to say this is, what are algae? Algae isn't, algae are. One of the things that we're going to be exploring today is just how diverse and what a broad umbrella the term algae really is. So, what are algae? Thank you for signing up for What Are Algae? I'm James Stevenson. You may want to jot down my email address here, my work email address, J, first initial, last name Stevenson, at pinellascounty.org. I'm with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, the Extension Service here in Pinellas County. We're a co-op, we're a cooperative with the University of Florida and our local government, Pinellas County, and we bring you information you can trust. We tell the truth. We don't have anything to sell, so we have no reason to BS you, as it were. We extend research from the university to provide you information to help you make decisions in your life. Not just because we're nice, but we are nice, but not just because we're nice. A lot of the advice that we offer is to prevent expensive problems for the local government from even arising in the first place. And that does tie into today's presentation. We're very well known, the Extension Service, for providing information on lawn and garden advice, right? Lawn and garden. We don't sell any lawn and garden products. We give advice about the best practice, the best plants, the best time of year, the best application rate, all these things. Because an improper application of a killer or a feeder could have a negative environmental impact, right? So instead of giving someone the advice if they come to us with a problem, and if we were selling something, we would sell them the product and say, use as much of it as you can and come back tomorrow and buy some more. What the Extension Service does is use the least amount once a year. That's it. Tests show that's the most effective application of that product. I hope that makes sense. What we're here to talk about, of course, is algae. So, what are algae, you ask? What are algae, you ask? Let's say you ask a friend if they've ever heard of algae, or if you say the word algae, what words come to mind? Generally speaking, people are going to associate that word with water, with something that's green, and you might even elicit the word slime or slimy or gunky. So water, green, and slime can be elucidated if you bring this word up. And of course, most of us have experience with this subject, with this umbrella term of algae, in a negative way. Algae is often referred to in a negative light. I've got algae growing in my bird bath. It's gross. What do I do? There's algae gunking up that retention pond in the neighborhood. We need to call someone and make it go away. We need to do something, perhaps put a fountain in, because there's some sort of cultural folklore that fountains are the opposite of algae, that somehow throwing water into the air and having it evaporate somehow counters the growth of algae. And in certain circumstances that, fountains might have an effect, but mostly they just evaporate a very precious resource, which is fresh water. So we've all heard and dealt with algae in different ways. And of course, recently, very important and not funny at all, a red tide event, a bloom of a toxic or an algae that produces toxins as red tide, serious health effects on humans, dire consequences to marine life, and the knock-on effect of both of those, of course, was a major hit on top of an already thumbs down couple of years as far as tourism is concerned. This red tide event caused by algae having this very negative impact on our local economy, health. We all know the effects of red tide on our marine life. Dead marine life makes beaches yucky. People don't want to go. Red tide can also put toxins into the air, which susceptible people can be very, very sensitive to. So yeah, red tide yucky. And this, y'all, if you haven't been keeping up, and I wouldn't blame you if you weren't keeping up with the news, this is a story that's been nearby recently. This was from, what was the 4th? Saturday, an update on this family, an entire family that were hiking, very experienced hikers in California. They were all found deceased with no signs of any foul play. And this gremlin, this goblin algae, this horrible thing is looming and is being investigated. This algae is being investigated as a possible cause of the death of this entire family. A story that I've been following very closely to see what they're coming up with. They did discover algae in a body of water, a type of algae in a body of water near to where this family was found deceased. Even the dog, they had a baby and a dog and them dead. It's really, really, really tragic. But toxic algae was discovered nearby. And so they're seeing, the toxicology reports have yet to come in to see if they can draw a line between the toxins produced by that particular algae and them. I read today that lightning could also be a factor. So we're standing by. But anyway, algae reputation is what I'm getting at. Negative reputation for lots of algae. But there are also, if you talk to a certain segment, definite algal advocates and algal adherents who extol certain, who will extol the benefits of certain types of algae for health, wellness, and nutrition. And if you've heard of spirulina or spirulina, or however you'd like to say it, spiral is where it gets its name. Spirulina is a type of this larger definition of algae that has been brought into cultivation by humans and is purported to have quite a few health benefits, nutritional benefits, a good source of X, Y, and Z phytochemicals, plant, even though it's not a plant, but we'll get there next. Okay, some people eat it. Some people eat these algae. Spirulina, old name, new name, still called spirulina in the trade. Technically, the genus is Arthrospira, and you can see here it's got this kind of coiled or spiral arrangement to its body. The individuals do. in mass, they become this product called spirulina that can be farmed, extracted, packaged, encapsulated, powdered, all these things. But this arthrospirulina does exist in nature, and when it proliferates, can form that same slime, gunk, goo, yuck, slick, nasty business that gives other species or other genera or other types a bad name. So here's one that one person may encounter this scene in a body of fresh water and say, that's disgusting, something's wrong here, we should run. Other people might say, no, look, it's this wonderful, nutritious, delicious, beneficial algae that we should scoop up and eat. Algae, to some people, are the seaweeds. The sea vegetables, as it were, are the algae. Here we have, these look to me like a genus that I learned is Postelsia, but it might not be. It doesn't really matter. These are classic marine seaweeds, holding on with things that aren't roots to this rocky bottom and displaying their photosynthetic surfaces to do their thing with the sun. Seaweeds, of course, very intimately tied to humanity. We've kind of lost track of sea vegetables in the West, even though they do have a history in Western diets. Still very popular, very economically important, the sea vegetables. In Eastern cuisines, I learned this genus Porphyra. I believe now it's called Pyropia. Doesn't matter. Again, it's a seaweed, and it's what the sushi wraps are made of. This particular sea vegetable, this algae. It's actually a red algae, and here are sushi wraps in the wild, growing as they would do in a marine situation. The kind of red ribbons here are that Porphyra. Other sea vegetables, of course, this one is Undaria. You can see in the upper left, that's what it looks like in the wild, but once it's processed, boiled, cooked, whatever, sometimes dried and then cooked or somehow otherwise processed. But anyway, you end up with this seaweed salad. And again, closely tied to more of the Eastern cuisines than, like I said, the Anglo-Saxons have a long history of eating the sea vegetables, but that has kind of disappeared over time. So algae, all these things, dangerous, slimy, edible, nutritious, big, small, microscopic, macroscopic, all of this. This is a photograph of an alga. An alga. This is an alga. This is an assortment of several kinds of algae. So there's what is algae? No, what are algae? This collection of organisms that we're going to see what exactly is that ties them together in just a second. So algae, plural, algae are, alga is. This is an alga called Volvox, a very beautiful green algae, a freshwater green algae. Now, when I tell you this is an umbrella term, algae, algae are, alga is, depending on who you ask, up to 1 million different organisms that get to be called algae because of what they do. So 1 million different things called algae, which is why this question, what are algae, is such a huge and complex question. And we're just going to scratch the surface of it today and hopefully spark a little bit more interest so we can dig deeper into each of the different particular kinds. And we'll look at a major breakdown of the different kinds of algae that fit within this big umbrella. But I promise we're not going to go over one at a time 1 million different kinds of algae, and I will stick to that promise. Algal would be the adjective, an algal bloom. That is what we read about, hear about, worry about. Some of us are these algal blooms, and algal, of course, is the adjective. Properly stated, the most important for coastal residents would be what are referred to as harmful algal blooms, or HABs. There are entire careers built around the study, detection, and monitoring of harmful algal blooms, HABs, of which, of course, red tide is certainly one of them. And when we use the word bloom, I want all 43 of you out there today to take this word bloom when it is referring to a harmful algal bloom or an algal bloom, and let's rip it free of any association with flowers. A bloom is when a color sweeps over an area. That can be the color sweeping over your face when you're embarrassed. I experience that quite a lot. My cheeks bloom red. Hillsides, of course, when there are flowers present, hillsides can be in bloom. There's a bloom across the surface of the hillsides. There's a bloom. It happens to be flowers, but anything that can cause color to spread across an area, that's a bloom of color. It doesn't have to be flowers. Let's take that word bloom away from flower. You can't hand someone a bloom, right? A bloom is an event. It's the spreading of a color across a space. An algal bloom is not a bunch of algae flowering. It's a proliferation of these organisms that cause this color to spread across an area. So an algal bloom is the significant proliferation of these microscopic organisms to the point where they spread this color across an area. This is an algal bloom. This is a photograph of a marine algal bloom, a red tide, because the color happens to be red. Algal blooms can be green, they can be brown, they can be olive. The color of the bloom can be diagnostic as to the species that we might be seeing blooming. I hope you get that. I'm still talking and I still haven't told you what algae are. So let's get to it. What are the algae? 1 million different organisms. For today's presentation, we've taken those million, well, we've taken a lot of those million, put it that way, and broken them down into 3 somewhat manageable groups. The Cyanobacteria, the green-red algae, and the rest, the others, that get to be called algae that are not cyanobacteria, and they're not green and red algae. So, of course, there's more, but these are the biggies that we're looking at just today. Okay? So the cyanobacteria are really bacteria. We used to call them the blue-green algae. Do you remember hearing about blue-green algae? It's still used today. It's still out there. Newspapers, media, outlets will use blue-green algae. Science is trying to get us to use the word cyanobacteria because it's got that definitive word in it, bacteria. You need to know, it's important to know that these are bacteria. And I'm going to show you how we get from cyanobacteria to the rest. It's actually pretty cool. The green red algae, these represent kind of a progression from the bacteria. And they represent a stepping stone towards land plants. But they're still aquatic. They're still algae. They're still, remember, water and green and slime? They're still the algae. They're still slimy water things, but they're a little bit more complicated than the complex, I should say, more complex than the bacteria. And the rest, we'll talk about everything else that's, well, we'll talk about some other of these million things that are aquatic and photosynthetic, and the phytoplankton, these aquatic photosynthetic organisms, the phytoplankton. Okay, so algae are, let's say that algae are like vehicles. Using the word algae is like using the word vehicle. When you say vehicle, you're referring to a thing that can and does move people or items from one place to another. A vehicle has a job that it does, and it moves people or things from one place to another. Okay? A vehicle can be as simple as a skateboard. Just 4 wheels on a plank, and it does the job of moving, in this case, a person from one place to another. A vehicle could be as complex as a rocket ship, a spaceship. Its job is still to move people and materials from one place to another. And it does. But it has many more parts. It's a much more complicated structure. The inputs and outputs are certainly very different, but at the end of the day, they're doing the same thing. One in a very, very basic and uncomplicated way, the other in a very extremely specialized way. Okay? Algae are the same. We have very simple, basic, and we have some very complex, but they do the same thing. Algae are aquatic photosynthetic. They're photosynthetic. They're mostly single cells, or they're filamentous or colonial. So either they live as individuals or they live in specialized colonial groups with a little bit of differentiation. And as you get more and more differentiation, you get more closer to, let's say, the rocket ship. You get more specialized parts that are set aside just for reproduction, that sort of thing. So algae exist on this scale. Mostly single cellular, sometimes filamentous, even colonial. And you can see then how things get a little bit more complex. So quick, what I'm talking about photosynthetic organisms here when we talk about algae. What are the byproducts of photosynthesis? You can say it out loud because no one's listening. You can talk to yourself. The byproducts of photosynthesis are oxygen, right? And carbohydrates. So photosynthetic organisms like algae can take sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide, and it can use that sunlight energy to take apart the carbon dioxide and take apart the water, CO2 and H2O, and reassemble the C's and H's to make the carbohydrates and release the oxygen, because don't need it, just put it out, it becomes atmospheric oxygen. So what was water, with the oxygen locked up into a water molecule, the oxygen is freed and it literally floats away from the system. So a photosynthetic organism, no matter what it is, that's what it's doing. Taking water and carbon dioxide, carbohydrates, oxygen, you get it. So using our vehicle analogy, algae photosynthesize. They create carbohydrates and release oxygen, just like our vehicle moves things from one place to the other. So the job gets done by a degree of complexity amongst the organisms that are doing this job. Algae do things just like vehicles do. Okay, I think I've made that point. Here I am still making this point. Let's move on. We'll start with these kind of least specialized, the simplest forms of getting from A to B. Our skateboard example are the cyanobacteria. And remember, they're bacteria. Bacteria represent, there are plenty of modern species of bacteria. Don't get me wrong, they're not a primitive thing. There's lots of modern bacteria, but they have this very bacterial body form that is very uncomplicated, uncomplex, hearkening back to those first life forms that were able to put themselves together, carry out a function, and reproduce. Feed, reproduce, feed, reproduce. We've said this a million times. That's really the only reason, not reason, but that's really all that living things do, are feed enough to reproduce. And the cyanobacteria got ahead of the regular bacteria in that they got the ability to photosynthesize. So there are photosynthetic bacteria, these cyanobacteria, and there, of course, are non-photosynthetic bacteria that have to get their resources, they have to feed, as it were, some other way. They have to take in chemistry from an external source in order to feed. They could be agents of decay, a lot of bacteria, agents of decay. They could be pathogens where they can affect the growth of a cell, of a multicellular organism, and cause it to fall apart so that it can drink up the insides, or the action of it acting on another cell could cause that cell to disintegrate, and those, of course, are the pathogenic bacteria. But the cyanobacteria, the photosynthetic bacteria, they just sit there and photosynthesize and reproduce. Bacteria are very, very, very not complex, very simple organisms. They represent kind of the first way that life got itself organized into a membrane-bound organism. Membrane-bound, external feeding. And what are bacteria made of? They have this, this membrane that surrounds the entire system. They have a little smidge of DNA that allows them to reproduce. It allows them to create the proteins that they need to build the pieces that they are made of. That's done here. The ribosomes, these little things that kind of float around, and they take the mRNA and use the code for the mRNA to build the proteins that then become part of the cell wall, and so on. And in certain areas within the photosynthetic bacteria, we have the green areas, the chromatin in this diagram. Chroma, of course, meaning color. So these are the colorful bit. If you're looking at this through a microscope, what you're really only going to see is this green bit. We all know what's causing that green color. We all know what the green pigment is that's associated with photosynthesis. Yes, it's chlorophyll. There's the chlorophyll. Here it is inside of a bacteria. That's where it started off, inside of bacteria. In real life, we have this oscillatoria, this cyanobacteria. It's a bacteria. It's an algae because it's aquatic, photosynthetic, single cellular. And this oscillatoria happens to, as a byproduct of its, what's that stuff called? Metabolism. As a byproduct of its metabolism, it kind of leaks these toxins. In this case, they're referred to as microcystins. So, not for any nefarious reason, it just is. It just does. It's just one of the things that happens as a result of this particular species existing and living and doing what it's supposed to do, photosynthesizing, taking that food energy that gives it the energy to make more. And that's, the birds and the bacteria. That's it in a nutshell. But anyway, just as a circumstance, this species happens to have these secondary metabolites that are called microcystins that happen to be toxic to us. Talking about bacteria being ancient life forms, let's just go back there for a second. We'll go back to the Hadean. Hades, you've heard of Hades. This was the time in the Earth's history when a planet had formed, but it was the hell planet, the Hadean. Things were still pulling together. We're still molten. We don't have continents. We don't have oceans. We don't got nothing. We're just this burning, horrible Hadean kind of place. We're 4.6 billion years ago. During this time, there's good evidence that the bombardment by comets in particular, comets, meteors, but comets in particular, were bringing a lot of this really wonderful molecule to our young planet. And that wonderful molecule that was being brought in, delivery, DoorDash, was water. So here we are 4.6 billion years ago. If you can conceive of that kind of time frame, I'm jealous. Very long time ago. Things start to calm down. Things start to cool off. things start to literally chill out. The water that's been delivered, of course, begins to find itself, because that's what water does, and having the particular properties of water, it sticks to itself and has a specific gravity, so it pools, and we end up with these oceans. And meanwhile, these chemicals are fixing themselves together into what we know as life. That early life can be represented by these bacteria. They're just simple things. 3.5 billion years ago, we entered this age called the Archaea, and we have life. And this is debatable, but we've got some pretty good evidence in the form of cyanobacteria, photosynthetic bacteria. Photosynthetic bacteria that became a film on the surface of an object, a stone, and were able to take minerals out of the water that they're living in while they're photosynthesizing and doing their thing and reproducing, and kind of forming these accretions, these little footstools that you can see kind of disappearing into the distance there. And these structures are called stromatolites. I call them stromatolites. There's another name for them, stromatolith, lith meaning rock, stroma meaning layered. These are some from the Bahamas that are still living and growing. Picture taken 8 years ago in the Holocene, the time we're living in now. It's these very slowly accreting layers of blue-green algae. So the bacteria had figured itself out, photosynthesis had figured itself out, everything good is happening, and they are exemplified in these structures called stromatoliths that are obvious to us. Of course, bacteria is not going to make a good fossil, is it? In the fossil record, but these stromatoliths do make very good fossils, and so we have ancient stromatoliths that are really old, and we can see the layers that were formed by these photosynthetic bacteria as they took minerals out of the water and just kind of made these I want to call them ottoman, but they're not, because they're not footrests, but that's about the size and shape they are. So they make these structures and they lay down layers very slowly over time, and they fossilize well. And we have proof that there were photosynthetic bacteria creating these structures a really long time ago. But remember what the circumstantial byproduct of photosynthesis is? We got the carbohydrates that are feeding the organism that's doing the photosynthesis. But what's being released when water is being taken apart to make those carbohydrates? Do you remember what photosynthetic organisms do? No, they don't make rocks. Just this one kind does. Photosynthetic organisms make oxygen, right? They release, they don't create oxygen from nothing. They release oxygen from being otherwise bound up. And the activity of these early photosynthetic bacteria, which was pretty much, the bacteria were the only thing that were going on Earth. And all this oxygen is being released as a gas. And so oxygen begins to become from a nothing component to a significant component of our atmospheric cocktail. Oxygenation of our planet, which you will agree, is a very important event. This was done by the activity of the Cyanobacteria algae. No hate for algae. Look what they did. The algae gave us an oxygenated atmosphere, making everything else possible. They still are. This cyanobacterial body plan, brilliant, sustainable. These organisms have had access to sunlight and water and carbon dioxide, and that's all they've needed, and it's still available, and they're still using it, and they're still doing the same thing. There's a modern species of cyanobacteria. I don't know how long it's been in existence. I don't know that it's kind of what it takes to figure that out. But this is a species that was really only described in the 1980s. It's been there for a long time, obviously. This Pleurococcus, this bacteria, this photosynthetic bacteria. Today, it's the smallest photosynthetic organism that we've observed, because remember, the bacteria are just the bare minimum to be called life. A smidge of DNA, a membrane, and the ability to feed and reproduce. Today, these photosynthetic bacteria, these algae, are producing 50% of the oxygen that is made available in our atmosphere. The trees, of course, get all the credit. And I'll say it again, there's nothing wrong with that. If you tell people that trees produce all of our oxygen and it makes them want to protect the trees, that's great. But you and I know that the oxygen is coming from the algae. In particular, the huge number of these photosynthetic marine bacteria that exist at any particular time, this number of individuals of this species, this number, 3 times 10 to the 27. If there's any mathematicians out there, again, I'm very jealous. I can't conceive of numbers that big, but let me show you in zeros what that looks like as far as numbers of these photosynthetic bacteria that are out there at any given moment producing the oxygen. 30, all of that. That's a lot. That's a lot of algae. That's a lot of oxygen. Being marine, being single-celled, being so very small, it has been found that through the action of the waves, that these organisms can and have been have found themselves into the atmosphere. And there's a whole study of aeroplankton that's taking shape. These things actually get up into the air and stay alive and continue to feed and reproduce. They can feed because all they need is water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide. It's pretty cool. So algae everywhere, and it gives you an idea of how algae can be so ubiquitous. They can fly. So that's an introduction to the photosynthetic bacteria. I think you've heard of bacteria. Hopefully you have a little bit deeper understanding of how simple and how ancient bacteria are, and how photosynthesis came up so early, and we're so lucky because photosynthesis, the accidental byproduct, is vital and was fundamental to how life then progressed over time to get us to where we are today. Not to get us, and it got us where we are today. The second group of algae, probably equally as recognizable. We know some blue-green algae. We know that, you know, Spirulina, the green and red algae, those include, they're not limited to, but they include a lot of familiar seaweed that a lot of people are just going to, if you say algae, they're going to think seaweed. So a lot of seaweeds are fall into this group of the green and the red algae. But how we got there is pretty cool. We have, let's go back a long time ago again. The bacteria have been doing their thing, but life continues to experiment. Life continues to mutate and grow and become more complex, more complicated. We end up with another branch on the tree of life that becomes the protozoans, the kind of pre-animals, the protozoans that might be familiar to you from, you know, high school biology or something like that. The protozoa, they were not photosynthetic. These organisms cannot make their own food. So they have to what? They have to eat. So the protozoans become, the protozoan really means, you know, before animals. So these are the things that, like animals, have to ingest their food. They can't make it, so they have to ingest it. I have an example of a protozoan. This is a modern protozoan. This isn't whatever would have existed a squillion years ago, but this is a modern, but it behaves in the same way. This one happens to be covered in little hairs called cilia that allow it to be mobile. So it's actually a hunter, this little thing called Fontonia. It's not algae. It's not algae. It's a protozoan. It's not making its own food, but I'm getting there. I'm telling you why I'm introducing this protozoan, because the Fontonia swims around and it gobbles up Cyanobacteria. That's what it eats. And here we have a Fontonia, this ciliate protozoa, and it's gobbled up some blue-green algae. It's gobbled up some cyanobacteria, and there they are. And it's going to feed on them. It's just going to eat them. Something very similar to this happened a squillion years ago. And the blue-green algae that were ingested weren't digested. The blue-green algae that got swallowed by this thing, unknown protozoan, weren't digested. They stayed. The protozoan had a mutation that prevented it from digesting this blue-green algae that was now inside. And the blue-green algae, you know, the cyanobacteria kind of looked around and it said, well, I'm still here. This thing is see-through. I'm just going to go ahead and keep doing my thing. So the cyanobacteria, the ingested bacteria, starts photosynthesizing or continues photosynthesizing, and the carbohydrates come off and the oxygen comes off, and the protozoan that ate it is like, carbohydrates for free. So this endosymbiosis situation originated, and that pairing got so specialized that the protozoan that swallowed the original became dependent on that thing to the point where we have an organism that is a green algae in and of itself through the activity of a protozoan swallowing this thing, and over time that symbiosis, that endosymbiosis, became a permanent situation and a new line, a new branch of the tree of life of organisms that have structures that are inherent in their body cells that are photosynthetic. And so the whole organism is photosynthetic thanks to the activity of those enslaved cyanobacteria. So there was an endosymbiotic event where a blue-green algae was gobbled up by a protist, and we end up with 3 branches from that one event. We end up with a group of organisms that became the green algae with chloroplasts inside that are photosynthetic. We have a branch of the tree of life that became what we know as the red algae with chloroplasts inside that represent those enslaved cyanobacteria. And this third really obscure group, the Glaucophytes, which I would like to just maybe, if ever, talk about them at a different time. Same idea though. These 3 branches represent what happened after an initial endosymbiotic event where a protist swallowed a cyanobacteria, they became dependent on one another and became an entire thing. And so let's look at the green algae as a branch and some examples of what we have today resulting from that original endosymbiotic event. So the green algae represent the modern species with these, the word that the scientists use is enslaved. The cyanobacteria that become incorporated into and dependent upon are referred to as enslaved. Endosymbionts is another one. We have these green algae. I'm showing a lot of pictures of this one because it happens to be my favorite. This is a 3-dimensional spherical colonial algae. It's photosynthetic, it's aquatic. The colonies form these wonderful microscopic spheres. This is a freshwater genus. It needs healthy water. Volvox is not known to have any toxic metabolites. This is just, it does its thing without the, byproduct of other types of algae with those toxic metabolites. Volvox just kind of floats. Many of the individuals that form the outside layer of this colony are ciliated, so they can flutter and allow this organism to kind of turn, spin, glide, putting the photosynthetic material closest towards the light source. Zignema is another green algae, which represents a modern species, but you can see the chloroplasts, which are what's left of those cyanobacteria. They have the same membrane, they have their own little DNA, but now they're called chloroplasts because they've been specialized and they exist in this thing, this filamentous green algae. The chloroplast in Zignema are star-shaped, so they're those little endosymbionts, those little captive cyanobacteria are kind of arranged in a star shape, which helps for their identification. Zignema is a common filamentous green algae that you will find in a freshwater. It does not have toxic metabolites that it releases into an area, but it could be one of those aesthetically displeasing algae growths, among others. It's just one of these freshwater filamentous algae. Sometimes you'll find these filamentous green algae like this one. They found a substrate, and in the person of the shell of this turtle, not harming the turtle, no toxic metabolites, just hitching a ride, finding a place to settle, growing, reproducing, forming this. Might do the turtle a little good, maybe for camouflage. Certainly any weight that the algae is going to add to the turtle shell isn't going to be a serious detriment, but not doing any real harm by existing on the shell of this turtle, one of these filamentous green algae. Other example of these green algae, we're not plants yet, we're still algae, but this is how we get there. We've got the ingested, incorporated, endosymbiotic blue-green algae, and all these body shapes have evolved along the same line. All of these organisms share a common ancestor. Remember those branches of the tree of life with the original endosymbiosis event, and then we have the green algae branch. These are all members of that group that have diversified to a myriad of body shapes, but they all have those endosymbiotic blue-green algae, which are referred to now as chloroplasts. Another branch, the red algae, the Rhodophytes. This one is called Asparagopsis because someone thought it looked like asparagus. There are a lot of edible red algae. I'm sure there are a lot of edible green algae, but for some reason the red algae group has more individual species and genera that have been exploited the most by humans, including Palmeria, which is a seaweed known as dulse. This is one of the ones that the Westerners would eat a lot of. This one would wash ashore. It could also be harvested not far from shore. This is one that has fake, they're not real roots because these aren't plants yet. They're photosynthetic, but they're not plants. It has these little structures that can cling to rocks, and so this one could be harvested and eaten. Dulse and laver is another one. Chondrus is another one of the red algae groups. This is where we get carrageenan gum from. One of the metabolites, one of the products of this red algae's, life history is that it makes this proteinaceous gel that humans have taken advantage of, carrageenan. It's something that's added to a lot of foods to give it structure, and it won't kill you. Just dipping our toe into that whole complex world of the green and the red algae. Cyanobacteria ingested, become these branches of the tree of life. Eventually, we end up with some green algae that is so complicated that it's got specialized organs for reproduction, and that's what puts us on the doorstep of becoming land plants. Once the reproductive strategy wasn't linked to being in the water, and once structures became more and more adapted to life on land, those green algae became what we know as the land plants. But we're not going to do that because we're talking about algae today. But I'm just telling you that, isn't that cool? Okay. Cyanobacteria, green red algae. Let's take a quick look at the rest of the phytoplankton that are referred to as algae. These photosynthetic aquatic organisms, good, bad, and indifferent. We'll look, these are referred to as the phytoplankton. Phyto being light, of course, using light, they're photosynthetic. They need the sunlight. The diatoms, which can be dastardly, like Pseudonychia. This is a pin-shaped diatom. There's two shapes. There's the pin-shaped and the wheel-shaped. This one causes one of the shellfish poisonings. But you can see the chloroplasts inside the diatom. Those green kind of pancake structures, those are the chloroplasts. And remember, those are basically their ancestors were the engulfed blue-green algae. Now they're living their lives as chloroplasts, but their own little DNA. They still have their own little DNA. And the deadly dinoflagellates. So these phytoplanktons, as opposed to zooplanktons, which are the animals, the phytoplanktons, these are the ones that have the chloroplast that can make their own food. Diatoms and dinoflagellates. The way that we get, or the way that we got diatoms was another one of these endosymbiotic events. Another one. It didn't happen just once. I say it all the time. Repeat after me. It's not Snow White out there. Everything is eating something. Everything is after something. So we had the something, some kind of something that was eating, browsing, going through the supermarket of the deep blue sea, and it ate up some red algae. Remember, red algae is now an established branch of the tree of life. We had the original endosymbiotic event where the cyanobacteria got swallowed and became integral to an actual organism that just happened, that just by nature had the endosymbiotic chloroplasts. Well, we have this established red algae species. Within it are the stacks of enslaved cyanobacteria, which are now referred to as chloroplasts. Something else comes along and eats a red algae, the nerve. And now the red algae has become the photosynthetic hub of a larger organism. And that became this branch of the tree of life that led to the diatoms. So the chloroplasts that you find within a diatom are not only bound by that bacterial membrane, but they're also bound again by what would be a red algae membrane. Crazy stuff. Crazy origin story, but then even crazier the amount of shapes that the diatoms take. You've heard of diatomaceous earth. They make their shells, frustules are what the shells are called. Their outer protective layer, what gives them their three dimensions, what holds that bilayer chloroplast that's got the bacterial layer and the red algae layer. What it holds that inside with are these frustules made of silica, made of glass, these beautiful glass boxes. They're clear so that their chloroplasts that they have embedded in their essence can have access to the sun. They're glass so they don't grow. So when it's time to reproduce, they split in half. They're put together like a petri dish. So they split in half, and the big side of the petri dish just grows a second side and floats off. The smaller side has to grow an even smaller bit. So they eventually kind of shrink away. The short end of the stick kind of thing are diatoms. Very important phytoplankton oceanic phytoplankton existing in the top 20 meters of the oceans, so they have access to the sunlight, forming the center of the food web, the primary producers of carbohydrates. When their silica shells, when they finally perish, their silica shells float to the bottom, and these deposits form, which are referred to as diatomaceous earth. So the diatomaceous earth are just the leftover shells, these silica glass shells. These creatures can take silica out of the water to create their shells with, and we get this deposit known as diatomaceous earth. There's a wealth of diversity among this group. Did I mention that there's basically two kinds of diatoms, the round ones and the pen-shaped ones, but you can see all sorts of variety in between those two extremes. The diatoms aren't necessarily known as being the worst when it comes to toxic or harmful algal blooms, but they're still algae, even though they're on this branch of the tree of life. They're still referred to as an algae. They still have the propensity to reproduce on a huge scale if the environmental conditions are just right. And they can release a toxin in small amounts. But if there's enough diatoms in the water column, releasing just a tiny little bit of toxin, and if the shellfish are taking seawater and filtering all the good yummy stuff out of it, those shellfish are then going to be concentrating, biomagnifying these diatoms, or at least the toxin from the diatoms. They're going to be concentrating that. And if it doesn't kill them, the bivalves, the oysters, the clams, that's what I'm talking about. Shellfish, you heard me? If you eat that shellfish that's been filtering out dastardly diatoms, it could make you very sick. And there's actually a poisoning from this diatom toxin called amnesic shellfish poisoning. You lose your memory. You eat oyster, you don't know where you are. Scary stuff. Dinoflagellates, another group of the phytoplankton, the photosynthetic plankton floating around in the ocean, can bloom, are these water sparkles. I think they're called water sparkles. This noctuica. They don't produce necessarily a scary, deadly toxin, this group, but they'll use up all the oxygen in an area when they bloom, and they can deprive other organisms of that aquatic dissolved oxygen. But what they can do, is this weird bioluminescence. These dinoflagellates are called water sparkles for this reason. When they're agitated by wave motion, they light up. It just happens. It's really cool. And you can go even into our Tampa Bay beaches and see this aquatic bioluminescence, and it's the result of these species, these different kinds of dinoflagellates that just happen to bioluminesce. It's pretty cool. I've seen it once. I stayed up late enough. But our main enemy when it comes to the dinoflagellates, our poster child for evil algae, is the red tide. Karenia brevis is a dinoflagellate. It's a phytoplankton. It gets to live in the umbrella of algae because it's unicellular aquatic photosynthetic, and its metabolites are called brevitoxins. And the red tide, the brevitoxins, are neurotoxins. So if you ingest these neurotoxins, they find your neuros, they find your nerves, they get on your nerves, literally. Not a deadly problem for humans, but they sure do a number on our aquatic species. Dolphin, manatees, the larger mammals are affected by this. More importantly, I hate to rank these things, but the kind of the middle of the food chain, the medium and small fishes are wiped out. And that knocks on the whole of the food web, these brevitoxins. As I mentioned before, phycology, the study of algae writ large, no matter what group we're talking about, the study of algae writ large, phycology, is a lifelong endeavor. Algae is incredibly important for good and for bad. They produce most of the oxygen in our atmosphere, but they also have these negative impacts on our economy, society, and environment. The three legs of the stool that we all sit on. Economy, environment, what is it? Economy, environment, and economy, environment. I should know this. Anyway, the three biggies. The presence of an algae, an algal bloom, can knock down one, if not all three legs. So through the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, FDEP, you can report. I think this is great. You go online and it asks you, are you reporting an algal bloom? No. Then why are you here? Anyway, you can say yes or no. If you say no, it takes you to, well, if you want to keep up with it, check out our dashboard. And you can keep up with harmful algal blooms. You can find out what species is being monitored, what species has been found, in what concentrations, what the harmful metabolite, what the toxin that is associated with that particular algae is being released. But you don't have to. Because if there is going to be an algal bloom, you're going to know about it. You're going to hear about it. It's going to be news. It is newsworthy because of the serious economic, social, and environmental impact that these algal blooms can have. What causes harmful algal blooms? A combination of factors. Algal blooms are normal. They are natural. Algae always exist. We looked at this. We looked at how diverse of a group they are and how they inhabit all the aquatic ecosystems that there are. This planet is mostly water, so we're mostly algae. What causes a particular species to explode? What causes them to bloom? What causes them to cover an entire, a large area with their particular color? That can come down to a combination of factors. Temperature, salinity, the amount of available nutrient, and that whole finger that I'm counting off. What did I say? Temperature, salinity, available nutrient. We could take this finger and break it into all the different nutrients. If it's an increase of phosphorus, if it's an increase in nitrogen, if it's an increase of iron, any of these, if there is a sudden unnatural proliferation of a particular chemical or compound that is acting as a nutrient for any particular species, it could cause that species to proliferate. And just the normal actions, which are normally benign, can then have a negative effect. There's a wonderful study of a group of whale, I don't like whales, a fossil bed of whales that all died at the same time. And it was a CSI case. And the best, they all sank to the bottom of this shallow lagoon. They weren't beached. Turns out that a landslide had caused a huge amount of iron from the soil to enter the waters, which fed an algal bloom, which the whales swam into and immediately died and sank to the bottom, and then another landslide buried them and they were fossilized. It's fantastic. So algal blooms are nothing new, but human activity can and does impact the severity and frequency of algal blooms by our unintentional introduction of nutrients into water sources. So remember how important remember how important algae is to us. They are the original oxygenators, and they are the current and most prolific of our planet's oxygenators. From the algae on up, the endosymbiotic event of a protist eating one of these earliest of the algae that led to the proliferation and diversification of algal types, and eventually led to land plants. And the diversity of land plants that we have today has led to, of course, the diversity of any other living thing on our planet. And even, I'm going to leave you with this, and even once animals came along, higher animals that have organs and parts and feeding strategies, and one opening on one end and one on the other end, and all these great things, then the animals realized that all they needed to do was to invite some of these algae and make them a part of their world. There is an endosymbiotic green algae that is a part of the tissues of a jellyfish. The Cassiopeia jellyfish incorporates algae into its body tissues, and then, this is great, and then it spends its life living upside down on a rock, presenting its photosynthetic endosymbiotic algae to the sun and not doing anything else. Just sitting there getting fed, using the algae to make its own food. And I don't need to remind you of the endosymbiotic algae that are associated with the fascinating organisms. The lichen, we've been over lichen a squillion times. If lichen happens to be a new subject for you, we invite you to check us out on our YouTube channel, where you can hear all about the life of lichen. We'll be putting a recording of today's presentation up on, what are algae, to begin with, what are algae in the broadest sense of the term. Lots of other subjects to explore on our YouTube channel. Just look for Pinellas County Extension is good enough. That should get you to this. Just keep your eyes out for that Pinellas County orange and blue logo. Thanks for joining us today. I apologize for keeping you over time. I seriously apologize for keeping you over time. Check out our YouTube, go to our Facebook, brookercreekpreserve.org for a list of upcoming events, both webinar and we're beginning to add guided hikes to our repertoire, and those will be advertised both on our Facebook and our brookercreekpreserve.org. Again, if you have questions, comments, complaints, concerns, do email me, jstevenson@pinellascounty.org. And I appreciate your attention today. If you have to go, I'm not offended. I understand it's 3:20, but I'm going to go ahead and open the Q&A and see about the questions that y'all have for me after I take a quick drink of water. The first question has to do with the harmful algal blooms, and I think we could do an entire hour, if not 2 hours, if not a 5-part series on harmful algal blooms. And I hope I touched on how humans affect the harmful algal blooms. The propensity of human activity tends to put more nutrient into the water cycle than would normally be in the water cycle, and so human activity can disrupt a balanced flow of nutrient into our aquatic areas. That disruption can lead to an algal bloom. Yes, I think I saw where algae could become a future source of petroleum. Yes, there is a lot of research and development going on into biofuels. A lot of the bio that's going into the biofuels, a lot of the bio is algae, because they can be so quickly proliferated and grown and bulked up to create remember that a byproduct of photosynthesis is carbohydrates, carbon, hydrogen, carbohydrates. It could also be hydrocarbons, so biofuel can come, different types of algae can be farmed to produce these biofuels. That's a whole hour in and of itself. Great question, or great statement. Are there any other places besides Florida that has red tide? Good question. Carenia brevis has a distribution across the northern Gulf around Florida, and about, I believe it doesn't go much higher than South Carolina, but it tends to be more trapped in the eastern Gulf than in other places. So these organisms can exist everywhere. It's just the circumstances where huge proliferations can concentrate that lead to these fish kills that can be, of a significant size. Carenia brevis might exist off the coast of, Charleston, South Carolina, but because of the currents, the chances of it becoming trapped and concentrated, and the chance for the water temperatures to be sustained at the level that causes these organisms to continue to proliferate, the chances are much lower. I hope that answers your question. Oh, the wallpaper behind me. Yes. This is an old German illustration of a freshwater algae that's called Pediastrum. Astrum meaning star-shaped. The Pediastrums are a multicellular green freshwater algae. Each species has a particular number of cells that form these wonderful star-shaped patterns. This is a really old German illustration because why not illustrate those? They're gorgeous. Thank you again for your attention today. We hope that we'll see you again. Next presentation will be on September 22nd, an introduction to plant identification. We'll go from the water with the algae, we'll evolve into land plants, and once we get up into the land plants, we'll talk about how to tell them apart. That's September 22nd at 2 o'clock. Again, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate your attention and your questions and comments, and as always, your attention. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.